So now let's actually start styling our collections page. The first thing we're going to need to do before we actually start changing the HTML in here is make a small correction to the collection item styles. So inside of our collection item styles, we want to change this width value from 22% to 22 view width. And the main difference between percent and view width is that 22% as a width is actually just 22% of the containing divs width. So if our containing divs width is 100 pixel, well, our width would be 22 pixels because it was 22% of that. But using view width, what this clarifies is that I want this component to be 22% of the width of the actual window. So for us, if we were to decrease or increase the window size, it would end up adapting as well because it always has to be 22% of the total window width. So that's just a small change we have to make for collection item. Now, inside of our collection component, what we want to do is we want to destructure off the title and the items property off of our collection. And then we are going to render the title in place of the text of our collection page. We're also going to give the h2 the class name of title. Next, we're going to make a div that will contain our collection items. And we will say class name equals items. And then we're going to map over our items array and render out the collection item, giving it a key of the item.id, as well as passing the item property, our item element. Now we have to actually apply our styles as well. So if you check in your resources, I of course have provided you with a Sass page that has those stylings. So just copy them over and place them into your collectionstyles.sass file. And now if we look, we'll see that we have all of our elements. Now, one thing we have to do is make it so that our directory will take us to the correct page that we're on. So going back to our application, inside of our directory reducer, we're just going to update our link URLs to have shop / and then the actual link we're trying to get to. So shop / sneakers, shop / women's, and shop / men's. Now, if we go back to our application, we'll see that our directory takes us to the correct category page. So let's take this moment and think about something that I mentioned earlier, that there are two ways that we could store this shop data inside of our reducer. So the way that we currently have it is that we have it as an array. And if we look at our shop selector, what we do is we call .find on that array, and we match the ID based off of the URL parameter that we get from our URL. So if we're on hats, we get hats, and we pass that into the selector, which then will find the correct ID responding to the correct collection item. The issue with doing .find is that we know that when we call .find on an array, we're using and passing this function on every element in the array from left to right. So in a worst case scenario, let's say we had an array of 1,000 items and the item we're looking for is the last one. Well, it would take way longer for it to iterate through every of the first 999 elements before it finally finds the correct collection item we want. And this is the flaw in storing data that we need to query individual elements for inside of an array. Instead, what we can do is we can store it in an object instead. If we were to store it in an object, you can see how it's similar to what we did here with our collection ID map, where we find the actual property of our object by passing it and dynamically rendering the property using this collection URL parameter. Except instead of getting the ID, we would actually get the collection object itself. This concept of storing lists of elements inside of an object instead of an array is called data normalization. And it's quite simple. We can actually do it with this collection that we've currently got. So let's go to our shopdata.js. And instead of an array, let's convert it over to an object. And what we'll do is we will set the key to the corresponding object with that URL parameter we're going to pass it. And usually we want to also make sure that something on this piece of data is going to be inside of the object as it's going to be the key. And we also want to make sure that the key that we do use exists in the object itself. Usually we would use an ID, but in our case, because our IDs are numbers, it's okay if we just use the title but lowercase, right? So for us, the title also happens to be the URL parameter that we're using. So we're going to pass hats to this object, right, as the key. And then we're going to do sneakers. And then we're going to do jackets for jackets, women's for women's, and men's for men's. Now, we actually have to also now update our selector, but this is way simpler because all we're doing, instead of doing a collection.find, is collections at the collection URL parameter. And we don't need this collection ID map anymore. If we save this and we look at our application, we see that it still works. If we go to our jackets, it loads our jackets, right? Because we're passing this URL parameter into our selector, and then our selector goes into this new collections object and just gets the corresponding value based on this property of jackets. And this is actually the ideal way that we should be storing large arrays of elements where we need the individual element inside of our reducer. This is actually a pretty common thing that we'll encounter when talking about backends and databases, especially when we look at the Firebase section. But all you need to know about data normalization is that all it is that you store lists of elements as objects instead of arrays. Now, we do have these items as an array, as well as these sections as an array. And that is okay for our case because we probably are not going to need an individual element inside of these arrays. If, for example, we had an individual product page where maybe we wanted the specific item, then we might do the same thing and convert these items that are existing inside of this array into an object instead. But because we don't need that for the purposes of this application, we can safely keep them in arrays. It's not a big deal. But now we've optimized this query search so that if this object of collections grows to, say, hundreds or thousands of items, it's just as fast searching for the last one as it is searching for the first one, because it just looks for the property on the object in order to get the corresponding collection object. Now let's move forward with our course.